worked with us after hours, got to know us a lot more, and we're glad that we can be part of the community and continue some of these discussions. But we're the regional development organization, and also recognized as the Federal Economic Development District for Southeast Alaska. Things does mining touch on for the community here and also in the region. So I'm just going to run through, because I know I'm the last thing before you and lunch, so that's not a very enviable time slot. But anyway, one of the things that first started the region here, throughout Southeast, but also in Haines, was the number of canneries. And it was rather an industrial scale at that time, and it helped build a lot of the infrastructure that we had. After that moved along, then that infrastructure got to be used for other things, which will be a theme through some of this. I don't know how many canneries. I didn't have the time to do that much research to find out how many canneries we had here, but I know we had them, a number of them, even on both sides, even across Pyramid Harbor was one, which will come back up here in just a minute as well. But also the timber industry, that played quite a role here for a number of years as well. And in the region, Ketchikan has a lot of infrastructure that was built up and then converted to other industries, maritime, shipbuilding, tourism. Haines, it's still working on some of its infrastructure plan, but it gave way to other business opportunities as well. And then, of course, none of us were around for the gold rush of yesteryear at the turn of the century, but it too played a role. Three of the four of those shots are here in the Porcupine district area, the mining district area. And so, of course, the gold rush I had to throw something in there for all of our favorite things. But I did want to make a point. John, he was almost single-handedly responsible for the upkeep of the Porcupine Road for 20 some odd years. And I think that is a theme that's continued with Constantine and other users there that have contributed to help provide infrastructure that most everybody in this room, I'd be surprised, there wouldn't be too many hands that would go up to say, you live here and you haven't been on the Porcupine or Sunshine Road system yet. I know there's two, and I won't shame you, because you're going to go out there soon, right, Mike? Right. But, that's where we all go, very big, and that's where we get our firewood. That's where, we go out, and that road infrastructure is paid in large by the industry out there. And even industrial-sized tourism, nearly, if you're not planned for it, if you don't build for it in advance, it can overwhelm you. And we saw that in some of the earlier years here in the community, where it just seemed like, there wasn't enough room in the road for them and us. But, I think that with enough planning, that there's opportunity to get the infrastructure built, and then it increases the quality of life and infrastructure you have available for other things moving forward. And so, before coming here, I sent out a number of emails to some of the tribes and some of the government folks in the region. Just asked them, I said, I'm going up to Haines to do this presentation, and I'm just curious, what are some of the approach, what are some of the feedbacks, guidelines? And this is what I got back. I said, we look to guidance from our elders, and this is from a tribal leader, and they provided the parenthetical, both tribal and non-tribal, and I think that it's important to take that wisdom and those lessons learned from those that have seen it, been there, and appreciate the value. And we need to collaborate and have community meetings. And that's why I really applaud Talk Schnook and the stakeholder group that's put this together, because I think the more opportunities you have to be face-to-face and work these things out, you really end up better in the end. And again, you're gathering the experts here. You're not getting anything technical out of me today, but there's been a lot of good information, and there'll be, I hope the folks get in tomorrow as well, because there's good speakers lined up there as well. And we've got the time, although sometimes it seems like it's almost too much time. I think this is the third 5-year plan that Garfield has told me that I should be prepared for, but I kind of believe him this time. So maybe we're a couple of years down that last 5-year plan. Look for lessons learned. What have we learned? What do we know? And incorporate that so history doesn't repeat itself in the wrong way. So some of the community benefits that have been seen in the region historically. If you've been to downtown Juneau, it didn't exist. Much of that is built right on top of mining tailings. You go across to Sandy Beach, as well. And I think, actually, that's my next slide. So I guess the first slide here was on the power side of things, where in the very beginning, much of the mines were built in the hydros to support mining in that community. And then, of course, it provides, for growth and for low-cost power, which is what Lake Dorothy is doing now with interruptible sales to the mine in Greens Creek. Allows AEL&P to have the lowest rates of any utility in the state for regulated utilities, and one of the lowest in the nation as well, for that matter. So, and then, of course, industry helping to pay for roads. I mentioned the one up the Porcupine. The same thing happens with Prince of Wales Island and other places where industry has gone in and the infrastructure gets left behind. The trails, there we go, the Juneau. I think there was like 90 million tons of tailings that got, in those early years of mining, that got put down, that became a large part of Juneau and the popular trails that were made possible. Comprehensive plan. So, been there, done that, talked about it, and this is a cut and paste straight out of the current comprehensive plan. Is to develop economically viable mineral deposits in a manner that complies with environmental regulations, protects fishery resources, etc., and promotes local hire. So I think that you don't have to tell the 5-year-old we're not going to burn down the house. I mean, I think it's a given. Everyone understands you're going to have clean water. You have to do it right. So, but we want to make sure that it happens in a way that promotes local hire and local benefits as well. And there's a map that is kind of sitting sideways, but that's also how the comprehensive plan. And you can see, if we had a pointer, the shaded area there, which is really at the top, is the mining district where Constantine and other mineral-rich areas exist, as well as the timber. So it's part of the local planning. And it's important to make sure that the infrastructure there and that there's not development that is going to be in conflict with the uses there. That's why you don't have the mining downtown. You don't have downtown to the mining. But and just to kind of move sort of quick. I'm going faster. I'm doing good. No, plenty of time. I'm zipping through anyway. Take a breath. So, some of the other issues for discussion, taking a look at how the local involvement can be more formalized and provide oversight and input. I think there's some examples out there down on Prince of Wales Island. They have all their communities get together. I think it's every other month, but it's on a regular basis where they talk about the issues that are within their community, that within the island at large. The Red Dog Mine has its own special oversight committee as well, and that provides direct input into the operations of the mine there that happens on their own land. But it's not always widely recognized or understood here in town that we've got 3 distinct governments in this valley, and you have a lot of stakeholders. So it's important to be together and to communicate and to make sure that things are done the way they should be done. Property taxes. I didn't hear. I thought I would have heard a lot more touting from the mining sector about the property taxes that they pay. I know in Juneau, there's probably close to $5 million of property tax and sales tax that goes in from the 2 mines that contribute to the local economy. The mine here would be smaller, but even $1 million a year would help you prevent some of the conversation you had last week about we have to keep increasing taxes. Where property taxes are going to go? How are we going to continue to support schools and activities and the things that we want to have here in the community? PILT, which stands for Payment in Lieu of Taxes. We get some of that from the federal government. for some of the things that they do not pay property tax on. It's a model that should apply to the Canadians as well. That's just a side. At the border, there's one Klahini Valley Fire Department person in the back anyway. Industry, when it develops, it helps shoulder those costs to bring the costs down for everybody. So those things are important because as you talk about whether there's a response going up the highway from police or fire service, you want to make sure that you've got the means to respond, but also that you're having the folks that are causing that cost to pay for the cost. And by and large, to date, we've seen them do that for sure with the road service area. And I think that there's opportunity for discussions on how these things will be developed in the future as it gets closer to time to actually construct a mine. The transportation improvements, which go, we've already talked about a little bit, that helps support the subsistence gathering in the forest and the firewood and just general access. One of the better places to go up there on a day. Actually, it was not so bad there this morning. Much nicer up the highway than in town. But the power generation, the Juneau example of Lake Dorothy could definitely be a model here in the community for when that submarine cable fails, and that submarine cable will fail. It may not be tomorrow, it may be 15 years from now, but all the electrical generation comes from the hydros over in Skagway, and whenever that cable fails, your power costs will at least probably double or triple until it gets repaired or replaced. So if there's opportunity to develop resources on this side, getting industry to pay for those is a great way. Whenever that Greens Creek mine is beyond its useful life and shuts down, Juneau will have paid for power that will continue to be some of the lowest costs in the state and the country. And I know the comprehensive plan calls for a goal of 15 cents or less. One of the best ways to do that is to work with your industry and to get that critical mass going. Workforce development, investment, vocational training, which is really, really important. So that's something that Southeast Conference does. Those of you that were at our annual meeting got a chance to perhaps join us at the annual banquet where we had the scholarship auction, where we raised about $17,700 for students going to UAS. A portion of that will be pulled for more of the vocational type activities and training that go into the mining activities that partners, AMA members also contribute toward that. So it's really important to make sure that opportunity is there for the young people, which really is the reason why we do what we do, is for our children, to make sure that they've got the ability to be sustainable. I appreciated Kimberly's remarks in the beginning about sustainability, because we have that opportunity with our rivers, with our fish, with our forests, with our ability to heat and to electrify the community, and to provide good jobs from the resources that are here in the valley. So I think that all combined with a real responsible and cooperative approach towards communication and planning, that Haines can be more sustainable and increase its quality of life. I think that the one thing we really want to try to avoid is trying to characterize discussions like this to where you force an ultimate winner or loser, because I think many of us saw with the Kensington mine, that was very contentious. It took, I think, close to 10 years to get permitted. It cost them close to $10 million. And there was opportunities along the way to compromise towards design that I think would have maybe been less acrimonious and a better solution, instead of waiting for the Supreme Court to pick a winner and a loser. So I would just encourage continued dialogue like what's happening this weekend. I hope to have more of those. And I think that I just wish you success. I think these big projects are sometimes can seem overwhelming. I know in working with communities like Prince Rupert, where they have natural gas pipelines looking to potentially come in there, the municipal advisory, the natural gas pipeline that the state has looked at twice now in the last 2 decades. There's been a municipal advisory group that has been formed to be involved with that so that communities can help address more than just the fuel. There's impacts on the community. So you want to embrace the industry to talk about, how to provide for schools, for all the other infrastructure that needs to come into place. And I think that, especially as you have conversations about LUTAC dock, how do we afford to fix that? What type of infrastructure is going to be needed there? You want to have that ability to support industry and also make sure that the revenue that comes across there can pay for those repairs. And so I think that there's some opportunities to provide for that. I think right now the last back of the napkin projections look like the revenue that comes across the LUTAC dock could only support a revenue bond for like $3 to $5 million, when the price tag, I think, of the Planning Commission's preferred alternative was closer to 30. So looking for ways to increase the commodities that come across there so that it's not raising the rates on grocery, but yet it gets paid for and in good shape for the generations to come. I think that's some of what we've seen happen both in the Juneau docks, the Ketchikan docks, and other places where they're converting old infrastructure to current day use. So there are a lot of examples around the region that kind of are analogous to what is coming here. There's lots of time to plan for that, and I applaud you for doing that. And we certainly want to help in those conversations in any way we can with information and information sharing and collaboration. So that's a quick run through for me. Get you out of here on time for lunch after your wrap up announcements. So we'll stand by for questions after lunch. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, everyone. And please, I know you have questions, so jot those questions down on the question sheets. And if there's not a box there already, put them on the table next to the sheets, and we'll see you back here after lunch. When you hear the ukulele playing, that's a good hint to come back, and we'll resume the forum. Thank you.
So we have a couple hours really this afternoon. It's Q&A. There were lots of questions submitted, which is great. So thank you very much for all the listening you did this morning and thinking and supplying questions for our panelists. And we're really happy that they're willing to be here. As you know, we have a couple people who didn't make it in today, so hard to answer maybe some of the questions that we got relative to what they would have probably put out there for you to understand today. Our panelists, we're going to do our best to direct the questions who we thought they would best go to. If they're not comfortable or knowledgeable about it, they'll probably let us know pretty readily. And we'll ask anybody else on the panel if they have an interest in taking a stab at it. Otherwise, again, I'm not sure what Derek and the forum organizers want to do with those questions that don't get answered, but they are being retained, so the forum organizers can make a decision about that. So we have 4 panelists, and there's water for you guys if you want it. And feel comfortable getting up and stretching. 2 hours is a long time. You all did so amazingly well with the presentation time we had sitting today, but it was riveting, I have to say. So, Odin, are you ready with a question?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, are we all here? Let me put these down.
Mm-hmm. You have your first one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let's start off here. Question it says Kendra. Now, I think if we may have questions that we can share in the answering of amongst the panelists a little bit, and so that's perfectly all right. But this one's addressed to Kendra. Can you talk about the impact of silver mining on water quality? abundance and health of fish. There were several of that question in the pile.
Yeah, I would actually
And
like.
I'll pass the mic, sorry.
I actually haven't looked at silver mining, so I think it's going to depend on the mix of the ores. And I think that when Pete Condon is able to talk, he worked at Greens Creek for 16 years. I think he would have a much better and more complete answer than I would.
Okay.
Can I follow up a little bit on that?
Yes,
Yes.
please do.
I just wanted to say a little bit of, I'm not an expert on that particular topic either, and Pete would be a great person to answer this question, but just from my knowledge of metals and water, and what we as a company have to do is test our water as far as baseline natural conditions, so that we understand what level of elements, not just silver or copper, but all elements are in the waters, and there are water quality standards for all of those. And so what DEC does is says, you know, there's different user groups. We want to keep our water fishable, swimmable, drinkable, happy for everyone. And certain users are more sensitive to things than others. Like humans are sensitive to E. coli levels. Salmon are sensitive to copper levels. And so they set a standard saying that this is our safe standard. And so when we measure water quality, it's not a yes or no, is it good water, bad water, kind of decision. It's really what are the levels of all these different parameters. And so when we report water quality data, it's got levels of iron and dissolved oxygen and copper and silver and different things. And so each water quality standard, it has different parameters that have to be met. So say for aquatic life, they might have a chronic standard and acute standard, and it might be 2 micrograms per liter, some unit of concentration that's the standard. But that's, if it's 2 for copper, it doesn't mean it's going to be 2 for silver and 2 for everything else. Each one will have its own number. And so that's the role of DEC, and if they were here, they could explain that, and then it could explain why they set that parameter as such, because as you see, if copper is in the water at a certain high level, it impacts fish a certain way. It may have, if there's high silver, it may impact fish a different way. So then they study those, and that's where they set each standard. So I don't know the exact impacts of too much silver on fish, but that would be why we have to measure all the different parameters in the water to meet all the different DEC standards.
And I'll follow up just real briefly on that. There's 7 different what they call uses. So that's what Liz is really talking about. So there's a use, it's human drinking water. Your arsenic levels are going to be most stringent for that use, whereas fish are not sensitive, very sensitive to arsenic. And so if there's no drinking, if it's not a drinking water use for that water body, but it's a fish use, then you're allowed more arsenic can go in by state water quality criteria than if it's a drinking water use. And copper is the opposite. Fish are obviously very sensitive to copper, cadmium, and a few other things, much more so than humans. So you, by default, all the waters in Alaska meet all uses unless you prove otherwise. So that's a little more answer.
And I'll just add to that silver is relatively inert, you know, like there's no standard for how much gold is in water.
Yeah, gold
Gold is completely inert. Silver isn't completely inert, but it's fairly inert. So it's probably not an issue with silver itself. It would be other things associated with the water, not silver.
Here's one addressed to Robert. If the industry has the industry and Constantine paid for the new bridge at Klahini, and is it overbuilt for the area, or is it built just to mine standards?
Oh, good question, because for the casual observer, you'd think that might be the case, but no, Constantine was not involved with financing that. That was all by the state of Alaska. And that actually was an ongoing thing since Mayor Hill, when was your first term? 1999. So about 1999 was when we really started negotiating with the state to replace the other bridge because they wanted that one to be sandblasted but pulled off the present pilings, drug ashore so it wouldn't have any particulates in the river, sandblasted, paint it, put it back, and so that was kind of ridiculous. So they've been working since then to have that replaced. So it is way overbuilt for any use that I'm aware of, but that means it's sufficiently built to carry the sand truck that the state uses, the big plow to go across there full of sand, and then the logging trucks that come across full of logs, as well as whatever other industries might use. So I will say that Constantine has been very active on the Porcupine Road, but not the bridge.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Oh, did you want to comment on that?
Okay, all right, great, thanks. So this says Russ and Cindy, but anyway, I'll do my best. As a geologist, how much do you think extreme hydrologic events and seismic activity will increase the risks associated with underground exploration and drilling at Constantine's Palmer project?
You can't, you're visual. I gotcha.
So for the hydrological events, I'm not sure if I'm really qualified to say what the risks are there. I assume that means flash floods. I can tell you that with seismic activity, if I was anywhere on that mountain during an earthquake, I would want to be underground because you're going to be safer underground because the rock is, once they've excavated it, it's a pretty stable thing as long as it's competent rock. I wouldn't want to be sitting on a fault zone underground when the fault moves, but just being underground is fairly safe, whereas if you're on the surface, there's likely to be landslides. So I wouldn't want to be underground if the portal is covered by a landslide unless there's another way to get out from underground. But for seismic activity, it's not really a big risk with mining, the underground mining itself. It's more of a risk for the infrastructure you have on the surface. Anybody else want to?
Just from the Constantine perspective, it's certainly something that we have to consider as we do anything there. And we know, we get regular 4 and 5 earthquakes all the time. This year there was the 6, the large ones that happen less frequently, but they certainly happen, and we have to plan for them. And it's certainly something that the regulators look for to make sure things are engineered properly. They have standards if you're working in seismic zones, and it's something that we're busy collecting a lot of information on right now as far as where are the rock slides, just not from earthquakes, but from erosion and things, and where are the avalanche zones, and the avalanches can be triggered by earthquakes as well. And so you certainly want to site your facilities in areas that are safer than other areas. And so we spend a lot of time now collecting that engineering data and to meet certain standards. But certainly, Greens Creek and Kensington operate in the same environment seismically, and Kensington's very mountainous as well and has avalanches and rockfall considerations. And so it's certainly something that can be done, but you have to make sure you have qualified engineers that are looking at the seismic stability properly. And so that will be part of any of our proposals. They'll undergo that analysis as well. It will be part of the permitting process.
And I'd like to make a comment on the hydrologic events. I assume that some of this would be a concern if there's waste on the surface that has to be impounded or have a barrier around it, and you want to make sure that there's no snow melts, no on-rain events, extreme flooding, extreme precipitation that overwhelms those barriers or impoundments. And there's also a caution of any movement of water from the tunnels through fractures and faults to the surface in a way that isn't anticipated. And as you do underground mining, you'll also be pumping a lot of the water out and do a lot of dewatering. So the mine's going to be dry while you're actually operating. Some of the events may happen after closure and after the water table rebounds. So those are some hydrologic things to kind of keep in mind.
This one's for Liz. When do you anticipate an update to Constantine's resource estimate?
For the,
It's a good question. It's coming from a lot of people right now. And certainly, it takes a lot of work to update a resource estimate, and there's some obligations when you do have a significant increase in your resource estimate to report that to your shareholders, especially, and as well as the public and other interested parties. So it's something that we have to analyze. We're still receiving the results from this year's drilling. We did, so the last resource estimate was in 2015, and I think it was before the year of drilling for 2015. So we had a couple seasons of drilling since that estimate. And the last couple seasons of drilling haven't been as successful at intersecting new mineralization. So there wasn't a real need for us to be updating the resource with that drilling. This year we have intersected new high-grade mineralization, and we're evaluating right now when might be the best time to recalculate that resource. We may or may not do it this year. It may be after next drill season. And there's a lot of reasons for doing that. And it also, sometimes they're recalculated based on changes of metal prices. So like Cindy and Russ pointed out, we calculated it at a certain metal price back in 2015. If metal prices change significantly, you may want to recalculate it for market condition reasons, because you're always comparing yourself to other projects, and it's nice to have a level playing field with metals prices. But so the answer is I don't know. But if we do recalculate it, it will be a very public announcement. There will be a news release that will announce our new resource estimate. And one of the requirements for us is that within, I think, 45 days or 90 days after that announcement, we have to publish a technical report, this 43101 report that's been mentioned, that will detail all of the details that go behind that calculation. And I just wanted to mention, some people had asked on lunch break too about this 43101 thing. And it is a Canadian standard for the securities exchange, but it's used in the US because the US doesn't have a similar process for exploration projects. And so it's a way to increase transparency to the public and to your stock market investors so that they know the data. And it's for us, we can't calculate our own resource estimate at this stage. We have to have a third party do it to help validate and make sure that we're not inflating the numbers. You know, they're validated by other parties. And so it's something that is a very public process, and it becomes a news release item because a lot of people are interested in it, and it will affect our share price as a company that's traded on the stock market. And so it's something that needs to be announced to everyone at the same time. And so what we have will remain our current resource estimate until we recalculate it.
Thank you. This one isn't directed to any one presenter. In your experience, have mining companies, and I'll insert Alaskan mining companies, expanded their projects beyond the initial scope of the project when first permitted? And goes on to ask, is the life of the mine routinely extended? If so, are subsequent expansions less likely to be denied because they already have an extension or an investment in infrastructure?
So it's the hope of every mine that they will find more and have it along the mine life. That's generally, when you come up with a reserve, which is an amount of material you think can be mined. You know, when we talked about the different stages, there's exploration and development and mining. Well, exploration continues all the way through the process, all the way up till you've finished mining, because you always want to be able to expand your resource and find more. That's kind of the way mining works. If you come up with a mine that has a 3-year mine plan, people aren't going to be very excited about just having a mine for 3 years and then you walk away and it's changed the economy of the town. They would rather have something that lasts longer, so they're always exploring for more, hoping that they can keep their investment going. They've already sunk a lot of money into the project. The more that they can find in the same place, the less money they have to sink into it to make it last longer. So So it's always the hope that you'll find more and be able to keep the thing going. Like in the instance of Greens Creek, they kept finding more and more and expanding out into different areas, which has helped the economy of that project. And Red Dog's done the same thing. Yeah, so lots of companies have done that. Some haven't. Some have gone in and they just mined out what was there and they never found anything more. But you don't know until you do that exploration. Anyone else?
I'll just add to what Russ mentioned there. And it's a two-part question for me. One was, will we change our plan? And like you said, hopefully, yes, in order to expand and extend the mine life. And part of that is due to exploration potential. Part of that is also due for economics. You know, these mines can cost $100 million or $1 or $2 billion to construct, and that's a lot of money in capital expenditure, and you want to be able to pay that back. And the sooner you can pay that back, the better, because then you're making money and be able to invest in future exploration. And so I just got an update on the Kensington mine the other day, and they purchased their equipment with a certain expected sort of mine life, and now they're actually extending it to the point where they need to replace the generators and start making that new capital investment into the mine. So certainly with this type of deposit, this VMS deposit that we mentioned, it's typically done that you would find one or two of those pods, those clusters of mineralization, expecting to find more. But right now we're just investing and putting money in the ground, and we'd like to be able to start making money at some point. And then you've got an operating business and a balance sheet that you can work with. At this point, it's all just investment in future potential. So those are some of the things on the mine life that might change. And then if you permit something for a 10-year mine life, you're permitting a certain size of surface facilities. You might have a mill site, a campsite, and those may stay the same if you extend your mine from 10 years to 20 years, but what will change is the amount of waste rock that you're producing. And so some of that will go back underground, but whatever is stored on surface then will have an expanded footprint. And so for like Greens Creek Mine, they had a certain footprint that was permitted, and then they wanted to be able to expand and extend the mine life, so they have to then permit additional areas to store that waste rock. So those are the things that happen as you're expanding the mine life. But then also to that is that, yes, whatever you proposed initially goes through a permitting system, and we'll give their approvals before you can construct. If you want to change that, it will go through a whole new permitting system. So there's no guarantee that you will get your permit for your expansion. It will go through and have to meet the same regulatory requirements for fish habitat protection and water quality protection and planning for the future. So just because something's in operation, there's no guarantee that you'll receive an expanded permit for the next activity.
That's I can't think offhand of an extension that has not been granted. So Russ, are you familiar with anyone? Okay. Maybe Jack, do you know?
There hasn't been one in the last week.
It's been denied? Yeah.
But the full answer there is people often ask, my permits have been denied, people will say no, inferring.
Hang on a second, Jack, if you're gonna give us a little more.
One of the questions that comes up a lot is whether the agencies ever decline to mine their permits, and while one answer is not really, they have not been, but what that means really is that they're often said no in the permitting process. The agencies will say, no, what you're proposing is not acceptable, so bring us a different plan. So at the end of the day, mines typically get all their permits and can go into production, but it's an iterative process, and there's always changes in that permitting process from what the mine was initially proposed to be versus what eventually gets permitted.
Thanks for jumping in there, Jack. And normally we want to keep our responses up here at the panel table if we can. Just for one thing, we are recording the proceedings here. And for another really big one, I know that this room is full of a lot of people with a lot of experience and things to share, but we'll just try and stay focused up here. I have a question, and I think this one's for Robert. but others may have something to say to it also, and I think I might use my moderator's license to alter the question just a little bit. So Robert, you stated that 8% of Haynes's population is employed by the mining industry. What percentage of our population is supported by commercial, fishing, and subsistence activities? So the question is a little more challenging the way it's stated, that maybe, here's my moderator's license, I'm going to ask you to maybe talk about how Southeast Conference in
I'm going
particular.
to ask you to hold that question for
Uh-huh.
a minute. I'm going to stretch my legs and
Okay.
get the answer.
All right. Okay, welcome back, Robert.
I got my
All right, he apparently has something back there that's magical to share with us. Thanks, Robert. Can I go ahead and state the question? Or are you really leaving? I don't know what he said. Okay, you know what? Maybe there's a short question and Robert can
We'll do that next.
work on that one, yeah. Here's one on acid mine drainage. So it may have more than one respondent here. Can you explain the lag time before acid mine drainage may become a problem and how it relates to this project? So Kendra, do you want to start and
I
then
can start, and
maybe?
I'm sure Russ knows a lot on that. Okay. It's complicated by a lot of things. It's not just the concentration of sulfides and carbonates, it's also the structure of the mineral itself and how it oxidizes based on the shape and the size of the particles. So it is very complicated, and it can take decades. It can go very fast or very slowly. But some of that does have to do with the size. So as you grind the material, so it comes in your tailings or those drill cuttings, you have a huge amount of surface area, and it weathers very quickly and is more likely to go acid more quickly. But it does get very complicated with mineralogy and a lot of other factors.
And to add to that is it's a good question. It's a question that needs to be asked through the permitting system. And it's something that we're starting to build the information for being able to answer that question. And so, like Kendra mentioned, it depends on even the mineralogy. So we call some of that work metallurgy. And so metallurgy is really about what metals are in your rock, how are you going to process them, how are you going to recover them from the mill, through the smelting system. And then your tailings are what's left over, and sometimes your recoveries change. The numbers I showed up there today, we said maybe an 89% recovery for certain metals, 92% recovery. That means that 8% is staying on the tailings that are left. But we may be able to enhance that recovery. So maybe we improve it from 89% to 95% over new technology or some different thing. And sometimes the grain size will be a factor. So the grind size is what the mill does. We blast it as big rock chunks, goes to the mill, and you mill it down to a certain size. The finer you grind it, usually the more you can recover. But it also costs a lot more money to grind it smaller and smaller and smaller. And so part of it is understanding that balance. And so sometimes you have a primary grind, and then you'll have a secondary grind. And that can change the economics of a project. And it depends on the size of your minerals in the rocks. And so our rocks are generally medium to coarse grained minerals naturally in the rock, which is good because you don't have to grind it as fine to get those metals liberated to make a concentrate that you ship away. So those are all the things that we're beginning to study to understand our deposit, and that will determine both the metallurgy recovery and the value of the deposit, but also then what are your tailings and how are you going to manage them. And it's all a question about how, and not a matter of if you're going to manage them, but how you're going to manage them and what it's going to take to manage them properly. And so some of those other tests, what we call is acid-base accounting. So you send rocks away to the laboratory, and they can tell you how many minerals you have in there that can generate acid, how many minerals are there that can neutralize acid, and what's the ratio and the balance. And so we're doing those studies for a lot of our rocks, not just the ore zone area, but also the waste rock, because you need to be able to get to the ore zone. So you're going to blast through rocks that are not the ore zone, and those will be waste rock. And sometimes your zone of interest is smaller than what you need to blast, and so you'll have extra waste rock. And so we need to understand the acid-base accounting of all of our rock types. And we can do that by sending them to a laboratory. They do little bench scale tests. They can do a variety of laboratory tests, which are different than real world tests as well. So Kendra mentioned barrel tests, and where you take actual core that's in our core boxes, and you kind of crush it up and stick it in a barrel and stick it on site and see what happens in the natural environment with the freeze, the thaw, the snow, the rain, the temperature variations. And you usually leave those barrel tests open, or testing through the life of the mine to see, is it going to turn acid after 5 years, after 10 years, after 20 years? Who knows? But you get that data both from the laboratory and real on-site data. So we've started to set up some of those barrels now. And there's water in there, and you test the water periodically, and those will be ongoing studies that will help us put together a mine plan that will incorporate what we call rock geochemistry and tailings and metallurgy that are all important to the economic analysis, but very important to the environmental analysis.
And again, it's the metallurgy, but it's also whether your minerals are crystalline or amorphous, those whether at different rates. It is understanding the structure of the minerals is part of it. Putting these field tests together is a really important part of it, and it's key when you design these to make sure you have representative samples, that you're representing the waste rock accurately, the mineral area accurately, and you're really understanding. You haven't just taken some spot samples, but you really have a representative sample that you're putting into these barrels. And if you have a pause in your exploration or your operations, if you can keep those barrels going, you don't even have to be sampling, just keep them open to the environment so that if you do start back up, you've got even more data. That would be super helpful. I've seen at least one operation where they simply covered the barrel, so then it's no longer quite as useful. And I think the last thing I want to say is when you're talking about waste rock, some of that is mineralized material. It's not economic, but if the price changes, it might be economic. So the waste rock can have a lag time because it will have sulfide minerals, and some are also have minerals in them as well as pyrite.
Did you have anybody else on that? Okay, Robert, let me ask the question. I'll go back to it here. And again, like I said, I'm going to change a little bit with mine. So you stated that 8% of Haynes's population is employed by the mining industry. What percentage of our population is supported by commercial fishing and subsistence activities? And then there's actually a second part to this question, and it's focused on really, I think what would maybe need to hear from you is, because the way it stays a little awkward, but if you could talk a little bit about how Southeast Conference decides to support an industry that, let's see, this says jeopardizes an existing sustainable, healthy way of life for mining in the Chilkat Valley.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll try to tackle that.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
do your best. Thank you.
okay. So, seafood. Just backing up to the region, seafood, and we don't have subsistence really calculated. I think we'll have more of that next year. We're working with the Central Council of Tlingit Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska to capture some of that data. So I think we'll have more of that going forward. But right now we do have tracked the commercial fishing, and the seafood regionally is about 9%, and which translates because it's a little bit better than the average wage. Workforce earnings in the region represents about 10% of income. Haynes is more, and Haynes represents about 13%. And Southeast Conference, we don't endeavor to try to pick or choose winners or losers of industries. We try to support economic development that it exists and can exist. And it's not by sacrificing one. It wouldn't matter if these numbers were 1 or 2% and something was 80%. We wouldn't say, let's go after the 80% and sacrifice the 1 or 2%. That's not the approach, because sometimes that 1 or 2% is 100% for somebody. So we try to take a balanced approach towards supporting all the economic industries in the region. We've got a whole list. We have priority industries that we focus on, whether it's tourism and the visitor industry, energy, transportation, but there's a whole list of the what we call miscellaneous that we just have underneath economic development. And here we go. Priority objectives in our strategic plan is transportation, energy, maritime, seafood, visitor, timber. Sorry, mining is not on the priority list. Mining is one of those other objectives that falls in there with housing and food security, communications, marketing, solid waste, education, arts. Oh, here we go. Here's mining, and then research and cultural wellness and healthcare. So we don't pick winners or losers. We try to be very supportive in a broad way because it all matters. Our region really faces a lot of challenges that we have to take a holistic approach. I hope that answered the intended question as well as when asked.
Hey, thanks a lot, Robert.
May I add something?
Oh, sure.
Just wanted to mention that that's something that we're interested in is not making it one or the other type industry, especially here in Haines. We know there's a diverse, existing healthy economy, and we would like to be here to just add to that diversity and add to the vitality and add to the sustainability of all of the industries and how can we work together. Certainly environmental regulations are important to make sure that the water is clean and the fish habitat is protected for important fisheries industry as well as the subsistence use of the area, and that's berry picking and hunting and fishing as well. And so we're looking at ways how can we benefit each other, how can we keep the balance of industries, how can we promote each other and share resources too. And for the tourism industry we can share infrastructure, and for other areas we can share cargo facilities, or we can work to benefit each other and have cross-industry benefits to help everyone grow and thrive.
All right.
I want to address to the geologists, but Robert, I'm sure you can.
Good try.
With the ores or metals being mined, gold, silver, copper, zinc, and method of extraction and refining, can you refer us to an existing mine with similar materials, minerals, topography, refining methods, etc., which is successful in avoiding massive environmental damage?
I'd say Greens Creek is the closest, and I can't tell you what their environmental record is. I know that they've been operating for a long time. There are probably other ones that are in steeper country like we have up the valley here, but Kensington is in very steep country like that, but it's not the same kind of metals. So it's gold, not the other four metals. So Greens Creek is probably the closest one in this region that I know of. Anybody else want to chime in?
I will add that if you're looking geographically, you might be looking in South America for mines in steep, high mountainous areas with the same or somewhat close mineralogy. Wouldn't be exactly the same.
And my understanding is there have been some problems at Greens Creek, and some of that is complicated, but maybe not enough baseline to show what is a natural fluctuation or a range and what is maybe coming from the mine. So again, getting your baseline and monitoring and continuing to monitor can really help pinpoint the range of natural fluctuations versus anything else that might be coming in.
I guess a couple things to follow up there about the mention of importance to have good baseline data. And Greens Creek opened up in 1989, and a lot has changed since then. And certainly there is a focus on making sure there's good environmental data beforehand, and that's increased. 1989 wasn't that long ago, but it's long ago enough that things have changed in the mining industry as far as ensuring there's good data collection, and that's something that at Constantine we've started very early. So we have already 3 or 4 years of fisheries data. We have, since 2008, water quality data. We have building this long data set over the years of exploration that will help build, and it's one thing that the regulators are very excited about, because often they're working with existing operations that don't necessarily have the same baseline natural conditions data going into the planning, whereas now for this particular project, they know that we'll be having a good set of data beforehand, and we work with the regulators as well. They come to site, they visit, they say, we think you should sample here, we think you should test this, we're going to be wanting to look at this much data, and so it's a collaborative effort to make sure we're collecting this information. And as far as other mine operations that may be similar, a couple things with the terrain. Yes, South America, lots of steep terrain, Colorado, different places, and then there's also just the weather environment. There's a lot of moisture and rain and snow in southeast, so you look for places like that because it changes your plan as well. And certainly Grades Creek and Kensington would have those similar environmental conditions. And as far as the metals go, if you remember the map I showed of all the different districts of this type of deposit, one of the areas that is mountainous and has lots of precipitation would be Scandinavia. And there's a lot of these mines in Sweden and Finland and Norway. So those would also be similar environments, and there's a lot of successful operations there, and they also very much value their fisheries and their water quality in those regions. Another example that I can give is the Myra Falls mine, which is on Vancouver Island, and it's a similar coastal environment. And that's another example, though, where it started a long time ago. That one actually opened up in the 60s, and it's still in operation, and it's one that's been able to continue to explore and find more and more of a resource to extend the mine life well beyond what they thought they were going to have. And the Myra Falls mine is located at the headwaters of the Campbell River fishery, which is also a very well-known thriving salmon fishery. And so for me, that's a great example of how even before modern regulations and modern baseline data and modern operations, the Myra Falls mine, which is another VMS deposit, was able to successfully still also support a healthy salmon fishery downstream.
And I'd like to add, like I said in my presentation, that the baseline data and monitoring should be collected by the mining company, by the regulators, and by the citizens, because everybody has a different perspective. They're going to design their programs differently, they're going to approach them differently, and they see different things. So when you bring all the data sets together, you have a much better picture of the entire system.
Kendra?
Here's one for you, Kendra, and it's similar, and I know you touched on these earlier today, but from what we know about the Palmer deposit, what are the top 3 risks or environmental risks that need to be studied and monitored?
I'd say the first one is your ratio of your neutralizing rock to your acid rock. And so, and making sure that the data that goes into those kind of graphs that I showed, make sure those are representative, and clearly stating what part is waste rock, what part is on top, what part is around, what is the mineral resource. So your acid drainage that ratio is going to affect that. So that's, I would say, one of your top ones. And the next would be hydrology and how that's going to impact the tunnels, and whether there are going to be pathways from the tunnels to the surface, and both as a human risk as well as an environmental risk. And that will be partly a factor of the competency of the rock, and partly a factor of the method of mining, whether it's a longwall type of mining, or if you do something called the block caving mining, that has a higher risk. Would you do that in a steep area like this?
It's been done at AJ in the past.
Okay.
I don't think that's in the plan.
Yeah, so the way that you mine can impact that to some extent. And then I think just the challenge of such a steep terrain and getting materials in and out safely, I think that's going to be something to just be careful of.
I just wanted to maybe let folks know, I guess, where we're at with each of those points that were raised by Kendra. So I'll just start with ABA data. Asset-based accounting is ABA. And that's something that we've started long ago, taking samples of different rock types and doing those tests. And that data comes out through permitting. And so if you look back at our road permitting, there was the potential that we would intersect bedrock with our potential road blasting. And so we took surface samples from mapping and we drilled some holes to collect subsurface samples and sent those all the way for analysis. And all of that data was presented during that permitting proposal and through the analysis to look at what that might be. So it didn't include ABA data for the whole mountain of all the different rock types, but it was relevant to that portion of the permitting. And those particular rocks are what we call hanging wall rocks, or the rocks that are above the ore zone in that layer. And those particular rocks we really like because they're full of calcite, which is this acid neutralizing mineral. And so Kendra had put up that graph of, the 1-to-1 ratio is where things might become acid. And so you like to have a buffer in there, maybe a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 ratio of acid neutralizing minerals to acid producing minerals. And the results from the bedrock where we were doing some of the road work, those were like 80-to-1. Like loads of neutralizing minerals to acid generating minerals. So those are the kind of rocks that you don't need to manage environmentally. You can use them to build roads. You can do other work with these rocks because they are so rich in neutralizing metals or neutralizing minerals. So that's the work that we're doing, and of course with each proposal that we put forward, if it involves rocks and rocks being exposed to surface, we will be presenting that data for everyone to look at. So we're busy collecting that and addressing that potential risk of what we call rock geochemistry. And hydrology, super important. I tell people often that mining and permitting these days is all about water, water, and water, and water. And so we collect a lot of data on water. It's the rainfall, it's the snowfall, it's the evaporation rates, it's the solar radiation, lots of weather data. Weather data from different elevations is important, so we have weather stations at different elevations right now collecting that data. You also want to know your surface water, your flows. We all know in this valley, some days the rivers are totally mucky, some days they're totally clear. In the winter they're super tight, in the summer they can flood. There's a lot of changes in hydrology of the surface waters, and we can have really rainy periods with lots of runoff, we can have dry periods, so we study all of those. And of course, each year is different, and so you want to get enough years of data to look at what the potential range would be. And for permitting, they usually look at what is your maximum rainfall that you want to plan for. But also we want to look at what is the groundwater doing. And so we do a lot of testing of groundwater. We've drilled holes specifically to access that groundwater, to test the quality of that groundwater, to test the pressure of that groundwater, because that's going to determine if you do put a tunnel in the mountain, what you need to do. And we also put in some of the drill holes, we stick a little thing down called a transducer, and it'll measure the groundwater level as it changes. In the winter it lowers, in the spring it recharges, and that'll change pressures as well underground. So we do a lot of work right now. We have a couple hydrology engineers working with us trying to model the groundwater table and its fluctuations, modeling the groundwater quality and flows and pressures. So that's very important data that we need to gather on the front end. So we've started to do that. For rock quality and mining method, there are special engineers that deal with those two topics, and we've got someone working with us on that. And it's one of the main jobs for some of our crew in the summer is when the rock comes off the mountain in the drill core boxes. We have, one of the jobs is a core tech. And so we've got a couple of core techs, they take pictures of all the rocks and that captures all the different fractures in there. And then they measure how frequent are the fractures, what angle are the fractures smooth, like will the rock slide against itself, or are they jagged so they'll catch and lock. So there's a whole system of engineering data that can be collected. How hard is it? Can you scratch it? If you hit it with a hammer, does it break easily? There's a lot of rock quality data that's taken by our core techs in the summer, and then professional rock quality engineers can use that data as well and do different studies. And that controls what they might need to do for the mining method. And if the rock is really broken, you might need to do more structural support. If it's less broken, you don't need to do as much support. And different areas of the mountain might have different quality. So we continually collect data, all those drill holes, we measure, we photograph everything. It's one of the pieces of data that we collect and will help us define a mine plan. And of course, human safety is very important to us, as well as environmental safety. And in the steep terrain, something again we look at in detail. Getting good topography data is one thing that we've invested in, so getting LiDAR data, which is high quality data where you can get really fine contours, and that allows you to do better planning and better modeling, and looking at avalanches, trying to collect avalanche data each year. So we do flyovers and take photos, we do terrain analysis and can model the avalanches, and that'll help us understand where we can put things safely, what might need to be avoided or what might be controlled. Like at Kensington, they do bombing to control some of the avalanches. So the steep terrain is something we look at for all factors as well, and it's something just even for the road building we've done was something that we carefully considered as far as where we could put that investment to make sure it was stable. So those are kind of where we're at. They're good questions. They're very important things for the permitting process, but there is a permitting process in place for those. They will be analyzed, and we've started to collect all the information we're going to need to present.
Okay, thanks for that.
And I'd like to just say real quickly that the risks are very different at an exploration stage than they are at a closure stage. So, you know, it's once you close a mine and you get the water rebounding into the tunnels that you find out what some of the issues can be. And you'll know a lot more before closure about what some of those risks are than we know now.
Thanks, guys. Hey, you guys have been listening to questions and answers for about an hour, and I have a question for the audience, and anybody can answer it, probably, although it's pretty tough. What are the 3 kinds of rock? Hard rock, punk rock, and classic rock.
Fair enough.
But you did very well.
Oh, definitely.
I don't know about that. All right, I just wanted to engage you again for a moment. Thank you. Let's see, here's kind of following on some of that we just heard. Could it be cost effective to add carbonates like limestone, dolomite to the tailings to neutralize the acid runoff? Now again, this is when you and if the mine gets up and running, because again, it's in the exploration phase, but in your future mental meanderings and paper etchings, maybe you have an answer to that. Mm-hmm. Geologists.
Yeah, limestone was added to the Flambeau mine, which is an open pit mine, and to date, that has looked pretty good. It has not gone acid. Again, whether there's a lag time, it's something people are still waiting to see. Whether limestone is even needed we don't know yet, because there may be enough carbonate that you simply don't need it. A lot of the material, the sulfide material, may end up going as paste tailings back into the tunnels, and at that point, they should be isolated from water and air. So yes, it can be used in some conditions in some places, but whether it could be used or would be needed here is it's way too early to tell.
I think it's great that we're thinking of solutions. If there is a problem, what is the answer? What is the solution? And then the question is, will it be cost effective as well? And so this is the fun stage of things, really, is where you can throw ideas out and see what's going to stick and do the analysis of them. And so, like Kendra said, we don't know yet if we're going to need it or what's going to happen. And one of the things that happens when you blow up rock is it obviously expands, and you can't put it all back together underground. And so the rock that comes out of the mountain would be sorted into waste rock and what goes to the mill for creating concentrate and tailings. And then the tailings like I can use Greens Creek as an example. They're sorted on their acid generating potential, so they have different classes, and those that have higher acid generating potential are the priority ones that go back underground. And so you can mitigate things a little bit that way, but you can't put 100% back underground. But what they do is they mix it with cement and they pump it back down. And so both Greens Creek and Kensington both have what are called paste plants, and that's where they mix tailings with cement and they pump them back underground to fill it up for structural and chemical stability. And so that may be something that we'll be doing at our project, but we don't know yet how much would be, left over. Maybe there will be enough room underground once you take out some of the minerals for concentrate and some of the extra barite and other minerals. Maybe there won't be. Maybe what's left over is not acid generating and all the acid generating material goes back underground. Those are questions that will be important for us to answer, and there may be alternative plans. And one of the things when permitting, you look at your proposed method, and you also look at alternative methods and analyze those. So those are things we're looking at. I would say one natural benefit, there's many benefits of the property here, is that the majority of the rocks on the property are very, very rich in calcite, this carbonate mineral that's neutralizing, so it gives you a lot of flexibility as far as developing things. If we were to go underground for exploration, perhaps you put your tunnel in that rock that is completely neutral and just drill into the ore zone, so you save that other step for mining, and that's something that we're looking at. So the geometry of those rocks are very important. The other thing is that we know that the immediate waters where we're at, it's a few miles until you reach salmon-bearing waters. And so that's a nice natural buffer. Obviously the water flows downstream into salmon-bearing waters, but you've got 3 miles of waters that are non-anadromous or non-salmon-bearing as well. And then in the area as well, there's lots of limestone. So someone asks, is it cost effective to add limestone or carbonate? One of the questions is, where's your source of carbonate? Do you have to truck it 400 miles or do you have to truck it 2 miles? That's a big difference in your cost. And so the fact that the valley here has a lot of limestone available, a lot of volcanic rocks that are rich in calcite, these are going to benefit our ability to look at our different ideas.
Yeah, and I think almost universally mines need water treatment plants, and that's where you start using your lime. So you may be able to add limestone into some things, but you'll almost certainly need lime at your water treatment plant.
Another advantage of concrete or cement mixed with the paste fill is it's very rich in calcium. So in addition to sealing it, making it unavailable, it also tends to neutralize it. So that helps a lot. So the closure plan is probably going to involve filling tunnels with paste fill, I would guess, as well, just to avoid that kind of problem.
Okay, so you want a crazy story? Okay. Here's from the non-technical. So anybody know where the southern border of the historic Dalton Trail Road Maintenance Service area is? Okay, so I'll tell you. It comes all the way to Pyramid Harbor, right across from Heather's house. And you know why? I know one person in this room knows why. I won't pick on you, Jerry. So we created that so that there could eventually possibly be developed this trail system that goes from Tidewater here all the way up connecting to the historic Dalton Trail. And so at one time I mentioned, I said, well, you know what? I have an awesome idea for tailings. We'll just make the whole trail out of it. I got a little less on some chemical possibilities, but if you encapsulate it, well, maybe, but think outside the box. So anyway, there's still that dream out there to have a world-class hut-to-hut. Jerry even suggested a swinging bridge over one of the chasms, but anyway, I'm trying to think of how to use these tailings and whatnot too, so it's a non-technical dream, but I thought I'd just throw it in there for you.
I like it when people think outside the box. And it's one thing, I mean, just on a kind of personal, not real technical note, is I know there's a lot of great people in the audience here with lots of great talents and skills and knowledge, and there's ability to think outside the box on these things, and I know that Haynes is not a community to shy away from a hard conversation or a debate on something, and I think that's going to benefit the project really well.
I went ahead and pulled when you mentioned the Dalton Road maintenance question for you, Robert. It has the Dalton Road Maintenance service area established a commercial user fee schedule to help pay for road maintenance, and if not, when?
Good question, and it's one that's completely bedeviled us since the time the ordinance was originally written. The taxpayers pay for most of that, and there's a provision, to date, the commercial users out there have donated more than perhaps been taxed. And it's something that is, because there's tourism use out there, there's forestry, commercial logging, firewood use out there, and then there's also the mining concerns. I know Constantina's continually provided cash and in-kind services, much like I referred to John Schnabel. Anytime he had his equipment down, not working actively in the mine, he'd have it out there grading the road and taking care of potholes, etc. And I know the borough has been very generous as well since taking that over to put in some capital funds. So I think that day may be coming, but it won't come until the current system breaks down. Right now, they've been contributing voluntarily, meeting the basic needs. So so far, so good, but that day may be on the horizon sooner.
And just to add to that, it's something, we moved our project from 33 Mile over to the Big Nugget area on Porcupine in 2013 is when we first moved the operation there and became part of the road user for Porcupine Road. And we've always been working with the borough on what needs to be done to help maintain that road. And we do in-kind work of cutting down trees or doing ditching and helping out with things as well as contributing some cash to the project. But we work really well with all the users out there. There's active logging users out there, there's tourism users, and so we try to work with everyone who has that bond available.
Yeah, Frankie would know more about this, but the Red Dog bond increased substantially once they found out they would need water treatment in perpetuity. It doesn't cost that much to revegetate and to remove the roads and make that all better. It's treating the water. And if you end up with water you have to treat for an unknown period of time, there'll be decades to hundreds of years to beyond what we know, that's what really increases your bond rates once you get to that point.
Just let me say something real quick. I'm not going to comment on Red Dog's bonding, but we'll save that question for if we get Kyle here on the phone tomorrow. I think that's a good question for him. So you have to all come back tomorrow. We have more questions.
Okay.
I'm going to combine a similar question from two people who pose it. The first one cites documented, I believe that's TSF, tailings storage facilities failures in the past, particularly in light of a highly active fault zone, such as we have here, and then the other cites since if Constantine has only existed for 10 years and Dawa for 100 plus years, and speaking to the treatment of tailings piles in perpetuity. The question is, what about bankruptcy and declarations that associated with that and guarantees that the operations will not dissolve or declare bankruptcy? And if that makes sense, combining the two questions.
I hope I'm not the only one on the panel to address this. Yeah, the idea of putting these traditional slurry tailings impoundments together, that is a concern because at some point many of those impoundments will fail. It may be 10,000 years from now, it may be next year. So there have been strong suggestions, and this was driven by the Mount Poly failure, but there's certainly been others, that we move away from tailings that have a lot of water in them, that causes them to flow a lot further and impact more area, and go towards more of a dry stack, or certainly if you have paste tails in tunnels, those aren't going to go anywhere. So the more water you can remove, if you've got a dry stack, then once it's in place, you cover it, you revegetate on top of it, and it's a stable landform. If you put paste tails back in a tunnel, that is a stable landform. So it's that traditional big slurry impoundment that people tend to be really concerned with, and probably for good reason. Those are impoundments that change over time. As the mine grows, you add to the dam. You don't build the dam all at once, you add it in stages. And depending on operating stresses, which can be the amount of minerals that be running low, or you might have a lot, what the price of the day is. When you're trying to keep a profit margin, you can change some of your operation. You may start to run out of the kind of competent and non-leaching rock that you want, and not build it as strong. There's different ways to design your dams, and that can change with each lift. So there's a lot of things that go into those traditional tailing slurries that make them a little more risky. And so there are more people trying to move to different kinds of ways to deal with tailings that are stable in the future.
So one of the things that I wanted to mention too is that it's a good question. There's lots of examples. There's a lot of good examples to study, and there's a lot of failures in the past that they've mentioned that we need to learn from and study as well. So the good news for us is that we're early in this process, and there's lots of time to study and put together a plan and talk about it. So nothing will be done until it goes through that process. But it's also important to know that each tailings management facility gets designed to the custom natural environment, the custom ore zone. Everything is site specific. So that's why we're really trying to study the data and determine what might be the best solution here. And the good news, one of the reasons again that I like this particular project, is by being a high-grade deposit, it means a lower production rate, and those are amenable to dry stack tailings. Dry stack is really hard to do when you have 100,000 tons per day of material going through. The high-grade mines that do smaller production at 2,000 tons per day gives you a lot more flexibility, and it's much more manageable. The engineering is such that they've figured that out at those rates. And so it's an easy thing to do for these small mines. So that's good news for this project, and it's good news that dry stack tailings is working in this environment. It works well at Greens Creek. We've got even less rainfall up the valley than they do on Admiralty Island, so it's certainly an option for us to consider. But right now we don't have all the information in hand to say this is going to be the best plan. And dry stack, there's many different types of dry stack. It's not just one type. They can do commingling. They do different ways. It's not a simple one way or the other. There's like a dozen different ways you can manage tailings. So those will be the things that we'll be putting together in our proposal. And as Kendra mentioned, there's efforts to make your tailings both physically stable and chemically stable. So you make them more physically stable by removing the water and making them dry so they don't flood. That's one of the real methods to make it more physically stable. And in an area with active faults, there's lots of dams built safely in fault zones. We may not need one if you're doing dry stack, and it's certainly the most obvious option for this project right now. But I also want to say that there's still opportunity for new ideas, and this is something where it's if we're not proposing to mine for another 10 years, things are changing so rapidly that there may be something beyond dry stack that we haven't even thought about yet, and that might be an educational opportunity even in looking for. We're looking at this as a challenge, but maybe it's an opportunity for students here to do master's theses or PhD and do some research, or looking at things. There's now bioremediation. They're using life to process acid and metals and tailings and do remediation. So there's new technologies that are being considered. There's existing ones that work great in a lot of areas, and there's new ones coming along, and I don't have that crystal ball to say what we're going to propose and how it's going to work and how we're going to meet regulations, but I'm excited by what's currently being done in certain areas, and also the possibility and how can the community even benefit from that research and from that work and doing the studies that we need to do to answer those questions.
Yeah, I guess I would just have a really hard time seeing a traditional slurry impoundment in this kind of an area. The local people, you guys here know the terrain much better than I do, whether there's even a location where you could do this. I don't, but I'd have a really hard time seeing a traditional slurry here. But there are new ways that are being learned, and then it's a matter of combining what you know works well with new technology, because you never want to go straight to new technology full scale. That's a real risky operation. So.
Did you have anything?
Is there any thing one can say safely about this notion of solvency or bankruptcy with mining companies or? Go ahead. Thanks, Liz.
So the bankruptcy issue was a problem in the past, and taxpayers and citizens were left with the job of cleanup. And so that's why Alaska has come around now with this reclamation planning and approval process, the bonding process, to help address that. So that's what's being done in Alaska now. That's why I feel good about mining in areas where this is in place. And so there are other jurisdictions in the world where mines don't have those reclamation and bonding regulations in place. And so if I look at where I want to put my energy into responsible mining, I like working in Alaska because I know there's strict regulations, there's good bonding, there's a good system here in place. And so that helps with the bankruptcy question. But also I wanted to mention one of the benefits of having a partner like we do with DOA is that, yes, we're a small junior mining company with no revenue. So it benefits the project and the community to have a company like DOA that's financially stable and can help financially stabilize the project, because you don't want the company to go bankrupt and create environmental concerns. It's nice to have a partner who will have the resources to follow through on those commitments much more strongly. And so we think having a partner like DOA really benefits the project that way.
Yeah, and I'll say that reclamation bonding in Alaska has gotten much better. It's not always perfect, so after we did that work at Pebble, just looking at the exploration and the amount of material that was left that the state might have to pay to remove if the company went bankrupt, because they actually were pretty close there for a bit. And whether those artesian holes could ever be filled, or if those were going to have to be a care and maintenance issue forever. They were told that they would have to come up with a $2 million bond, which they did not have before we went out and did that work. So, having a fresh set of eyes, looking at a site from a different perspective can be helpful. It could be helpful to the state and help them understand what the financial issues are. And the other kind of cautionary part of that is, because metal prices go up and down and corporations kind of flux as well, there can be periods where a project goes on hold for a while and then comes back up. So at that point, you have to make sure the place is environmentally stable, and whether that's for a year or 5 years or 10 years, it may just be in care and maintenance for a while, and that can be a stress on finances as well. So those are areas where you have to be really careful that you're bonding correctly.
That just made me think of one thing too, is with this type of deposit. So when Kendra mentioned that the metals price can really affect a mine operation, it's very true for mines that are single metals. And so the gold price, if the gold falls below $1,000 an ounce, Kensington's losing money, so they're going to go into care and maintenance. They only have that one metal. And if your operating costs are much, much lower than the current commodity price, you're in a good situation. If you're close to that price, you're at risk of having to go into care and maintenance. Whereas this particular project, one of the reasons I like VMS deposits is they're called polymetallic. So they have more than one metal. So with copper, zinc, gold, and silver, those commodity prices will fluctuate, but often they don't fluctuate the same. They don't all go down at one time, they don't all go up at one time. You might have a low copper price and a high gold price, or a high zinc price and a higher silver price. And so often these polymetallic deposits can weather financial waves a bit better because they're buffered by multiple metals. Another benefit is that these particular deposits are zoned. So often a certain area is more copper rich, a certain area is more zinc rich, a certain area is more silver rich. And if you can forecast the metals prices and look at the geometry of your deposit, you might take advantage of those price swings. And so if you anticipate that zinc price will be strong for the next 5 years, you might go after the more zinc rich part of the deposit, and you're able to modify your mine plan and make the changes at the mill, because the mill will operate differently depending on what type of ore you're sending it. So you can't make that change overnight. You have to engineer it properly, but it's something that these polymetallic mines are able to do.
Thank you.
Okay. I was left thinking about Greens Creek, and they had a short period of time where they were actually downsized and then came back up to full operation and then increased their operation actually. Something to think about for the region for folks, put that in their heads. Here's a question about artesian wells. And I'm not sure we did a definition of artesian wells. Actually, we talked about them, but did we define them? And so whoever, it could be several of you, you might want to just talk a little bit more about how is it defined as an artesian well. And then this is really directed towards Constantine. So Constantine has hit artesian wells in drilling test sites that are currently dumping contaminated water into the Klahini watershed. What, if anything, are you doing to mitigate this? I suspect you're going to want to comment on that. Liz, but let's talk about artesian wells first.
Liz has been talking too much, so even though I'm not a hydrologist, I'll explain that an artesian well is a well that is basically a spring. It's pumping water into the environment without having to pump it out. It's got a natural pressure to it that sends the water out. Okay, that's my bit. Now we've talked.
Yeah, and when I showed pictures of artesian drill holes, it just meant that the groundwater was pushing up so hard that it was coming up with varying degrees of force. Some of it was just bubbling, and some of it was really shooting out pretty fast. So it just means that groundwater is moving from either the top of the mountain or the top of another mountain range, maybe far away, and is moving through that. It's just maybe even a regional groundwater flow that is pushing up out of these holes.
Yeah, I can answer this, and this will maybe help address Sally's question from earlier too. But one of the differences between what was being presented at Pebble and what we have at our property, as you mentioned, is terrain. And so we've got steep terrain out there, and the water table is lower. And often we start our drill holes at the top of the mountain, and we drill through rock that is dry, there's no water in that rock, and then we get down and we hit the water table and then keep drilling into rock there. And the rock is fractured, and so in the drilling process, it's circulating water, and this water stays in the groundwater system. And for the majority of our drill holes, that's what happens. We finish the drill hole, and even if you left it uncapped, there's no water coming out of it, but the reclamation plan includes putting a steel cap on there and capping it off for reclamation purposes. And we do have 3 artesian drill holes on the property, and we anticipated it was going to be that way. As we drill lower on the mountain, and especially if you drill in horizontally, once you hit the water table, it's going to come out. And we do that specifically in these cases was drilled to sample the groundwater to build that important baseline data set to understand the groundwater pressures and the groundwater qualities. And so we drilled one hole in 2014, and that was specifically a groundwater well, and we worked very closely with DEC beforehand to put a plan in place of how we would drill it and how we would put the mechanism together and keep it available for future water sampling. And then we've got 2 other drill holes on site that became artesian. One was drilled in 2015, one was drilled this year. And both of those are low flow. They flow at about 16 gallons a minute. It's like a hose water. And it's slow enough that you can just put a steel cap on there and there's no water that comes out of there anymore. So it's plugged there. And we've installed on one of them a Margo plug, which is something you stuff down the drill hole and the rubber expands and you can turn a faucet on basically if you want to test the water for future groundwater. It's available to test it and then you can close it. They're drilled for, in our particular case, they're drilled for environmental monitoring purposes or data collection purposes. And so we have those in place to gather the data we need for future permitting. And they will be reclaimed when we no longer need them available for groundwater testing. The 3 of them are capped right now. The one of them has been authorized by DEC to flow if we need it to flow, but we do have the valve. All holes are closed right now, nothing's flowing. So there is nothing going into the Kleehene River or the Glacier Creek River. The one that has flowed, sometimes we leave it open over the winter and DEC has authorized us to keep it flowing over the winter so it doesn't freeze up. That water is of high quality, we've tested it. All the parameters meet water quality standards. The water is alkaline, it's good, clean water. It's not reporting to a creek or anywhere, it's reporting to groundwater. It basically comes out the mountain in a pipe and there's a hose on it, and when we want to test it, we sample it. Otherwise, it goes back into the talus, into the groundwater, out and in, and it's clean water.
Thank you. Another good question. Thank you for addressing it. I'll ask one more question, and then we'll talk a little bit about tomorrow, and then we'll have time for a couple more questions if people are still up to it. But a couple of you, or all of you, have mentioned Greens Creek Mine. So here's a question about that. What risk does Juneau face with tens of millions of tons of tailings that will need active water treatment forever, according to the Forest Service, on land now annexed into CBJ at Greens Creek? Does that raise any?
I don't think any of us are qualified and experts in commenting on that, and we'll leave it maybe to Kyle Moselle from DNR, who regulates the Greens Creek mine, or Mike Satry, who is their counterpart at the mine, who would be available to answer.
Okay, and we will
Yeah, and
say
I
that.
should say that
for-
CSP2 has been involved in looking at the Greens Creek mine, but that was my counterpart, my boss, Dave Chambers, and I am not that familiar with the project. So I hate to comment on it. I know there's other people that know much more about it than I do.
Okay. And we've saved a few of these for Kyle, and noted his name. So that said, I'm glad that to see that it looks like the planes have been coming in, and Jim Calvin is here. Jacinda Mack came yesterday, so she's here, one of our speakers tomorrow, and so we'll have, and we're still planning on Alan and Kyle getting here, so they'll be our morning presenters. It was a great morning of presentations about geotechnical challenges and procedures for mining proposed in this area, about the mineral value assessments and local values to this potential mining operation. And so, did you have anything else, Frankie, you wanted to say about tomorrow or this afternoon, and then we'll pose a few more questions if folks will.
Yeah, actually, I think it's important for folks who, some may have had to leave already today. There's another opportunity for panel Q&A tomorrow, and I think most of the panelists will be here, plus some other ones. And so there's still some remaining questions. We probably won't ask them all, although maybe I should test the audience's ability to withstand another half hour of Q&A. So are you willing and interested in continuing forward for another half hour or so? Yeah, okay, excellent. Well, then I have... No, they're sitting on hard seats. They probably wanted to leave an hour ago.
Or stand up for a minute. You guys doing okay?
We could do the hokey pokey.
Okay.
Wait, does anybody know what the hokey pokey is besides me? How old is that? All right. Yeah,
Okay.
oh, that's not me. I'm not there yet. Probably the gray scary. Okay, so I have I think these are relative to each other, and again, one of our panelists tomorrow will be able to add a little bit more to it, but I think a couple of you can probably talk about this somewhat today. One part of this is really directed towards Constantine, and so I'm going to read both of these, and then, you guys are kind of answering what you want to answer anyway. Which part of the question you want to answer, not that you're making up answers. But anyway, okay. Is a mixing zone a possibility on the Klehini if it remains a Tier 2 water, and what would that look like? That's a question. Relative to that is, if Constantine has no intention of polluting the water, as you claim, which would drastically hurt the economy of the Chilkat Valley, why is Constantine against a Tier 3 designation that would help prevent water pollution? So it does look like it's directed towards Liz, but I suspect if anybody else has experienced Tier 2. Tier 3, you may have to add something to that.
Me first? So 2 questions there. One is specific, and DEC and DNR could probably answer with more experience, but my understanding, so when you have a mine, you have water, and you have to discharge of that water. There's different ways to discharge it, and there's different permitting paths to discharge the water. One that can be used, and I don't know if Constantine would ever apply for one, but one that can be used as a mixing zone, and that's where you use existing water to mix and essentially dilute the discharge to meet water quality standards. But there are a lot of regulations in place that you can't get a mixing zone just anywhere, and I believe, and maybe someone here can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you're not able to get a mixing zone permit in anadromous waters, and the Klehini is anadromous, and therefore you wouldn't be able to under existing Tier 2 regulations. And Jack's nodding his head, so I think we're correct on that. And as far as Tier 3 goes, there's a lot of discussion on it, and one of the things there's a lot of complex things with the topic, and one is, what is the state process, and what would a designation like that mean for this particular valley and other users of the water, and there's a lot of unknowns until the mechanism is put in place by the state process, and what that would mean, and then it becomes site specific, so it doesn't necessarily have a cookie cutter effect here, there, or everywhere. It depends on the natural water quality here and those users, what the impact would be. But one thing I will talk about, and maybe leave it for the regulators to expand upon, is that pollution is a term that is thrown around as if it's always toxic or detrimental, but there are a lot of things that are considered pollution by the EPA and by DEC that are still meet water quality standards. And it can be, even fish guts are considered pollution. And so Tier 3 would ban any fish processing facility and stormwater drains. So if you had a stormwater drain to discharge, that would be prohibited because it is considered pollution. So there are a number of things that are allowable under existing Tier 2 regulations that are allowable pollutants, but are not necessarily harming. What we discussed earlier was the user groups, the fish, the drinking, the swimming, the different users of water quality. And that's why water quality standards are in place, in order to set the standard of what is acceptable and protective of all the users. That's the existing Tier 2, and Tier 3 is very different from that.
So I guess actually I had a question for Liz related to this. Did you say that you have 2 or 3 miles of stream before you hit anadromous water? So it seems like that could be a mixing zone then. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, depending on where the facility and the discharge is. So where, if I had a map I could show you, but where we permitted a bridge crossing at the upper reaches of Glacier Creek, and from that point down 3 miles is anadromous waters. So depending on where you could put a facility, maybe somewhere in between there, and then from that bridge point, a mile down there's some resident fish. There's some dolly martins that low areas. But so yes, there's different areas, but I don't know where any facilities would be. They may be down Lower Porcupine Road. I don't know at this point, and I don't know if they would need a water discharge permit or not, and if they would need, if we would need to apply for mixing zone.
Yeah, and of course, this is talking about the effluent from a water treatment plant, which we're so far from thinking about a water treatment plant. But once you get to that stage, there are mechanisms like reverse osmosis and membrane technologies that can clean water really well. Then it's a matter of how much expense you want to put into it and making sure you're doing the maintenance and replacing the membranes quickly enough. And then it really gets back again to monitoring. Are you monitoring in the right place enough times to understand if it's being kept clean as well as it needs to be? And some of those technologies take care of most of the things you call contaminants. The one arsenic can be harder to take care of. That could be something you might need a mixing zone for, depending on concentrations and your flow through your water treatment system. And selenium can be one that's really difficult if they run into selenium. So it really depends on what you have to treat and the technologies you're using, whether you need that mixing zone or not.
Thanks, Julie. Okay, one for everybody. The history of mining in the Chilkat Valley is placer mining, assuming it's underground. How is large-scale underground hard rock mining different, and how are the impacts different, i.e. from placer mining?
I guess I'll talk on this one. I'm not an expert on underground mining or placer mining, but I know the basic differences. Placer mining is using surface gravel and extracting it with a loader or with a hydraulic hose or with a big flume of water. There's been lots of different ways that you can do placer mining, but the one thing that all placer mining tends to do is the same thing glaciers do. It puts a lot of silt in the water. The underground mining doesn't disturb the surface as much. You're going to extract the rock from deep underground. You will haul it out, process it, and send part of it back underground. Really, it's a totally different picture. Underground mining has much less surface disturbance. Anybody else? Wow, I could answer one.
Yeah. I was starting to look for another one because I think you addressed this, Liz. How much financial assurance has Constantine put aside to deal with any accidents that may happen during exploration?
I think I answered that before, and so we use a statewide bond pool, and Kyle can explain more about how that functions right now. And I believe our calculation for the last permitting process, don't quote me, it was either $250,000 or $350,000 that we had anticipated for reclamation cost. I believe it was $350,000. So that's to reclaim all the drill holes, making sure anything. Right now we leave some of them open for environmental testing. We have PVC tubes down there so we can stick water transducers and do a few things, or put geophysical surveys down there. So it would cover the cost of helicopter time to finish plugging all the drill holes. And right now we leave some of the wooden platforms up to help with landing sites for different studies and future drilling. So it covers all of the additional reclamation for the drill pads. And then the big expense really though is the road reclamation. And it was interesting going through the permitting process for that, because some people asked the regulators to leave the road open and not require it to be reclaimed because they want to use it for tourism or recreation or different things and leave it there as an asset. And so that, something that would be considered in the future, but currently it's required to be reclaimed, and there's a bond in place for that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. You guys look like you're getting a little fatigued. Maybe just a couple more questions. Here's one that I'm not sure who wants to answer it, but what % of mines after closure are maintained into perpetuity or until all environmental hazards are neutralized?
Yeah, I'm not not sure the answer to that. I do know that, some are, especially smaller ones, are reclaimed and you never have to go back. So I think after Illinois Creek went bankrupt and the state went in and took care of that, I think that one's been stable ever since. I don't think we're really getting into the perpetuity issue until you get to things like Red Dog, which haven't closed yet, so it's hard to say. But they have that traditional slurry with the dam that is going to need to be watched for a long time, and they will have water treatment that has to go on essentially forever. And the state has not actually ever permitted a mine that they know will need water treatment forever, except they are looking at permitting Donlin, and they know ahead of time they'll need water treatment forever. So it's really an area of new territory, these large mines with knowing you're going to have to watch these things forever. It's new territory in Alaska, really, as far as I know.
And of course, I can't say what this project will become and what the plan will be at the time. It's certainly a good question to understand what is the reclamation plan and how will it be bonded for, what is the ultimate closure plan. Can we walk away at the end of the goal is to be able to walk away and have it be chemically physical stable and have, the residual legacy is positive, whether it's, access and infrastructure, additional facilities in the area and educational advancements and maximizing those legacy items. And so, I think they're good questions, they're important questions, and they're questions that for our project we'll have to put together plans and discussion points specific to this one, and so we'll see. We always study other mines in the state and elsewhere, and learn from them, and engineer things accordingly and plan them. But it also is contingent upon community feedback. And usually, when we put together a proposal, it doesn't come out the other end the same. It usually benefits from all that back and forth from regulators and the public, and it changes to make what's going to make it right for this particular area. So we'll just have to wait and see on this particular plan. And we'll see what, Kyle may have more information on that from the state perspective of what's happening there on state lands. So.
Yeah, the mining industry is really in this evolutionary process where, we started with the gold mining and the placer mining, and a lot of those, you just dump the tailings and the waste rock in the nearest creek and wanted to be flushed out of there. And this, this method of trying to impound it and keeping out of creeks was the next step, and that's the step that we really don't know how to deal with that for thousands of years. And so people now are looking at moving away from that where they can, and hoping to get stable landforms. So it's an evolving process, really all over the world. So I wouldn't look just in Alaska. I would start looking in other parts of the world as well and see what works as a permanent solution and why. What factors brought that together.
Thank you. I think we're going to ask one more question here, especially since you panelists will be here tomorrow also, and we'll have more questions. Some will be re-asked or redirected tomorrow, and I'd especially want to thank the audience because you provided a lot of good, insightful questions, and you're present and you are informed, so that's great. Before we close, I have an easy question here that's not specifically directed to anyone, but are there associated royalties with a mine in this case, with state and federal claims? How much and who gets them? And for example, the Mental Health Trust.
Well, I have to admit I might have to pull up my computer to give an accurate, perfect number here, so I won't misquote myself here. But it's an important question, and it's a way that really mining is designed, especially in Alaska here, to benefit everyone. It's a way for everyone to share in the benefits. It's a state resource or it's a federal resource, and they're extracted for the benefit of all. And so it's not just the company coming in and making a profit. It's also the state gaining those benefits as well. And there are different percentages for different lands, and it's a little bit of a complicated thing that I don't have fresh in my mind right now, but we do have a little bit of an interesting situation with our property in that we do have BLM land, that's federal land, that's been state selected and trust selected, but it hasn't been conveyed, and so it's still BLM federal land where the resource is located, and many of the prospects. And then we do have some state mining claims, and then we have a larger lease with the Mental Health Trust. And so all three have different mechanisms in place. We also lease the federal claims off of the underlying claim owner, which is Merrill Palmer and his partners as well. So all of those things, the money gets split many ways when you extract it, and really though the benefit for the residents comes through in those royalties, and so they're an important part of the consideration because that is how the state generates revenue for its budget. And I don't know what the line item is right now of how much the state is getting of revenue from state lands, but even on native lands too, so the native land mines, that money goes toward the native corporations as well and gets shared. So there's different money in there. There's a couple percent here and there. I think on the mental health trust land, it's not standard, and it's part of our lease as far as where we produce it from, how much it would be. But there's also some negotiations that go on for other portions of it as well. So it's something I'd have to get back to you on. It's an important one. It's probably one we need to follow up on. But there is a percentage amount. Off the top of my head, please don't quote me. I can look it up online. I think it's 2.5% on the mental health trust lands, and that money gets used to fund mental health programs for the state.
All right. Okay, well, with that, once again, we'd like to thank the forum organizers, and for the greater good, is there anything, Derek, or anything we need to add? Well, tomorrow, we start at 9 o'clock, is that right? According to mine. And good, well, we'll see you all here tomorrow. And the schedule will, hopefully we'll have the remainder of the speakers that didn't make it today.